Her fingers closed around the plastic tubing of my daughter's breathing mask, and she yanked it clean off Emma's face, and Emma's eyes went wide with a kind of silent panic I will never forget as long as I live. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The cabin lights of that Delta flight from Charlotte to Phoenix hummed overhead. A baby cried 2 rows back. Someone's tray table clicked shut. And my 9-year-old daughter, who has lived every day of her life with a spinal condition that makes every breath a small negotiation with her own body, sat there with her mouth open and nothing coming in. I need to take you back to how this all started. Because what this woman didn't know, what none of the passengers around her knew, what the flight attendants standing frozen in the aisle didn't know, was exactly who she had just made the biggest mistake of her life against. My name is Diane Marsh. I'm 44 years old, and until 11 days ago, I was just another exhausted single mother from a quiet suburb outside Charlotte, North Carolina, trying to get my daughter to a specialist appointment in Phoenix without incident. I made coffee that morning in a chipped mug that says, "World's Okayest Mom." A gift from my sister that always makes me laugh even when I don't feel like laughing. I drove a 10-year-old Honda with a check engine light I've been ignoring for 2 years. I am, by every visible measure, an ordinary woman. But I have spent the last 6 years of my professional life inside rooms where the wrong sentence, spoken to the wrong person, could unravel diplomatic relationships that took decades to build. I have sat across tables from men who would just as soon see me fail as shake my hand. I have learned, in ways most people never have to learn, exactly how to stay perfectly calm while everything around me is falling apart. I had faced far more dangerous situations than a coach cabin on a domestic flight. I just didn't expect to face one here, on a Tuesday, with my daughter's oxygen line in a stranger's fist. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. I was born in Gastonia, a mill town outside Charlotte, to a father who drove a delivery truck for 31 years and a mother who taught 2nd grade until her hands got too shaky to hold chalk. We didn't have much growing up. I remember one Christmas when I was maybe 7, my father worked 3 extra weeks of overtime just so there'd be a bicycle under the tree, and I remember him telling me years later that he'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every single one of those days to make it happen. That's the kind of quiet sacrifice I grew up around. Nobody in my family made a show of anything. They just did what needed doing and moved on. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I studied international relations because a professor in high school told me I asked too many questions to ever be satisfied with easy answers, and something about that stuck with me. I remember him saying it almost as an insult, the way teachers sometimes do when they mean it as the opposite. I went home that night and looked up international relations programs for the first time. I went on to law school on scholarships and loans I'm still paying off, and eventually I found my way into government work, the kind that doesn't make headlines but keeps the lights on behind the scenes. I spent years in postings most people have never heard of, doing work most people will never know about, learning how to read a room the way other people read a book. I don't talk about my job much, not because it's some dramatic secret, but because when I tell people what I actually do, the conversation changes. People get careful around me. They start choosing their words, laughing a half-second too late at things that aren't funny, apologizing for opinions they'd have stated flatly to anyone else. Most days, I don't want that. Most days, I just want to be Emma's mom, sitting in a folding chair at her physical therapy sessions, cheering when she manages one more rep than the week before, worrying about carpool schedules and whether we have enough milk in the fridge. In my line of work, I had learned to read a room in about 4 seconds. I could tell you who held the power in it, who was bluffing, and who was about to do something they couldn't take back. It's a skill you don't get to turn off just because you've boarded a Boeing 737 economy cabin instead of a conference room in Geneva. I have sat through 6-hour negotiating sessions where a single misplaced word could have cost lives on the other side of the world, and I have learned to let my face show absolutely nothing while my mind runs through every possible outcome of the next 30 seconds. I remember a posting early in my career, long before Emma was born, when I sat across a table from a delegation that had every reason to walk out and no reason at all to trust the country I represented. I remember the silence in that room, thick enough to touch, and I remember understanding, for the first time, that the person who speaks first in a moment like that usually loses something they can't get back. I learned to wait. I learned to let silence do work that words never could. I learned that composure isn't the absence of feeling, It's the discipline of not letting feeling drive the car. That skill followed me everywhere after that, into rooms with far higher stakes than any airplane cabin, into conversations where an entire relationship between two nations hinged on whether I could keep my voice level while someone across the table tried to provoke exactly the reaction that would let them walk away and blame me for it. I have never once, in all those years, given anyone that satisfaction. I was not about to start with a woman in a blue blazer who thought my daughter's breathing was an inconvenience. I have a vulnerability, though one I don't often admit to. I have a hard time forgiving myself for the years I spent traveling for work while Emma was small, the years my sister stepped in and rocked her to sleep when I was on a flight somewhere over the Atlantic. I carry that. I carry it every single day, and it's part of why, when I'm with her now, I am fiercely, almost obsessively present. Nothing gets between me and my daughter anymore. Nothing. There's a specific memory that still catches me sometimes, usually late at night when the house is quiet. Emma was 2 years old, still learning to manage her condition, still small enough to fit in the crook of my arm during her worst breathing episodes. I was in Brussels for 11 days that particular stretch, coordinating logistics for a summit that mattered enormously to people who were not my daughter, and my sister called me at 2 in the morning her time to tell me Emma had been rushed to the hospital with a respiratory infection that had turned dangerous fast. I remember standing in a hotel bathroom in my pajamas, phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, listening to my sister's voice shake as she described machines and tubes and doctors speaking in low, urgent voices in the background. I did not make it home for 4 more days. Emma recovered. She was fine. But something in me never quite forgave the distance, and I promised myself, standing in that bathroom with the tile cold under my bare feet, that I would find a way to be different. Present in a way my job had never required of me before. I kept that promise, mostly. I turned down postings I once would have fought for. I built a life that could bend around Emma's needs instead of the other way around. And on that Tuesday afternoon flight to Phoenix, sitting beside my daughter as a stranger decided her breathing was an inconvenience, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I had not built that life just to watch someone else threaten to undo it in a single afternoon. My daughter Emma is 9 years old. She has a rare form of spinal muscular atrophy that was diagnosed when she was 14 months old, back when she was still small enough that I could carry her cradled against my chest with one arm, back when the diagnosis felt like the end of every plan I'd ever made for her life. I remember sitting in the pediatric neurologist's office in Charlotte, my husband at the time, we divorced 2 years later, though that's a different story for a different day, gripping my hand so tightly his knuckles went white while the doctor explained, gently but clearly, what our lives were about to become. I did not know that day that Emma would grow into the most stubbornly joyful human being I have ever met. Emma loves horses more than any living creature loves anything. She has 43 plastic horse figurines lined up on her windowsill in a specific order that she will reorganize immediately if anyone touches them. An order that makes sense only to her, something about which horses get along, and which ones need space. As she puts it, she hums when she's happy, a tuneless little melody that seems to come from somewhere deep in her chest. And she has the kind of laugh that makes complete strangers in grocery stores turn around and smile without knowing why. She has an encyclopedic knowledge of horse breeds that puts most equestrians to shame. Despite never once having ridden a horse in her life, something her physical therapist has promised we will work toward once her core strength improves further. She uses a portable ventilator system with a specialized mask for parts of every day, more when she's tired or when her lungs need extra support, which is common with her condition. It isn't medical equipment to Emma. It's just part of her, the way glasses are part of some people and hearing aids are part of others. She calls it her breathing buddy, and she picked out the purple strap herself from an online catalog because purple is her favorite color, has always been her favorite color, since she was old enough to have a favorite anything. She named the machine itself Gary, for reasons she has never fully explained to me and which I suspect she invented on the spot the day I asked and has simply committed to ever since out of pure stubbornness. Emma's physical therapist, a patient woman named Renata who has worked with her twice a week for 6 years now, once told me that Emma has the most stubborn will of any child she's ever treated, and she meant it as the highest compliment a therapist can give. Emma has spent years relearning small movements other kids take for granted, has cried through sessions that left her exhausted and sore, and has never once, not in 6 years, asked to quit. She simply gets back on the mat the following Tuesday and tries again. I have watched my daughter fight for range of motion in her own fingers with the same fierce determination some children reserve for winning championship games. And I have never been prouder of anything in my life than watching her do it. She also has a habit, one that started around age 6 and has never gone away, of narrating her own life out loud in a low-running commentary, as though she is hosting a small documentary about herself that only she can hear. And now Emma picks the purple crayon, she'll murmur to herself while coloring. Because purple is the best one, obviously. It used to worry me slightly, until her pediatrician assured me it was simply a form of self-soothing many children with her condition develop, a way of narrating control over a body that doesn't always cooperate the way she wants it to. Now I find it one of the most endearing things about her. On the plane that day, before everything went wrong, she had been narrating the loading of the luggage cart below us in exactly this fashion. "And now the man puts the blue suitcase on first," she whispered, "because it's probably heavy, and heavy ones go on the bottom. Smart man." Before we boarded that flight, Emma had spent 20 minutes in the terminal at Charlotte Douglas International Airport naming every horse breed she could think of to a gate agent who had, God bless her, absolutely no interest in horses but pretended beautifully. Emma was laughing so hard at her own joke about a horse named Broccoli that she nearly slid out of her wheelchair, and I remember thinking, right there in that terminal, how lucky I was, how the hardest years were behind us, how we had found our rhythm, the two of us, moving through the world together in a way that finally felt steady. I did not know that in less than 3 hours, a woman in a blue blazer would decide my daughter's face was an inconvenience to her personal comfort. We had pre-boarded, as we always do, and settled into our row. Emma was by the window because she likes watching the ground crew load luggage, something she finds endlessly fascinating in a way that still makes me smile, narrating the process to herself under her breath like a tiny sports commentator. I was in the middle seat, and the aisle seat next to me was empty when we sat down. I remember hoping, the way you hope for small mercies on long flights, that it might stay that way, or that whoever filled it would simply not care, would put in earbuds and sleep the whole way to Phoenix. That's when she arrived. She came down the aisle the way certain people move through the world, like every inch of space belongs to her and everyone else is simply borrowing it temporarily. Mid-50s, expensive sunglasses pushed up into blonde highlighted hair, a blue blazer that looked tailored, gold hardware on a handbag that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and a rolling suitcase she expected someone else to lift for her, which a young man 2 rows up in fact did, without being asked, the way people do for women who project a certain kind of unspoken authority. I noticed, before she'd even reached our row, the particular way she scanned the cabin as she walked, the way her eyes swept over each row like she was auditing the other passengers for their worthiness to sit anywhere near her. I've seen that look before in rooms with far higher stakes than a coach cabin. It's the look of someone who has spent years being deferred to by people who had something to lose by not deferring, a store manager afraid of a bad review, a waiter afraid of a stiff tip, a neighbor afraid of a formal complaint to the association board. It is the look of a person who has never once, in her adult life, faced a consequence proportional to her behavior, and who has come to believe, somewhere deep down, that this will simply always be true. I found out later, through the flight manifest and the subsequent investigation, that her name was Deborah Whitfield Ellison, and that she served, at the time, as secretary of the Homeowners Association in her gated community outside Dallas, a position she had apparently used for years to issue fines against neighbors for infractions as minor as a mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige. I did not know any of this on the plane. On the plane, she was simply a woman in a blue blazer with an expensive handbag and absolutely no idea what she was about to do to the rest of her own life. She stopped at our row, looked down at her boarding pass, looked at the seat number above our heads, and sighed loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Of course," she said, to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone. "Of course I get stuck next to this. I want to be clear." She had not yet looked at Emma's face when she said this. She was looking at the ventilator bag tucked under my daughter's seat. She sat down, adjusted her blazer, snapped open a small mirror to check her lipstick, and pulled out her phone. And for a moment I thought that would be the end of it. People have bad days. People say thoughtless things and move on. I have learned not to assume the worst of every stranger, because most people, when given the chance, choose to be decent. I have negotiated with plenty of difficult men in my career who turned out, once you got past the posturing, to simply be tired or scared or in over their heads. I try to extend that same grace to strangers. She was not most people. 20 minutes into the flight, once we'd reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had gone off, Emma's ventilator made its familiar low hum as it cycled. A sound so quiet most people never notice it unless they're listening for it. The woman noticed it immediately. "Is that thing going to be doing that the entire flight?" she asked, not looking at me, looking at her own reflection in her phone screen. "It's a medical device," I said, keeping my voice even. The same voice I use in rooms where the temperature can drop 10 degrees over a single misplaced word. "It helps my daughter breathe. It's very quiet, and I promise it won't bother you." "It's already bothering me," she said. "I paid for first-class treatment on this airline for 15 years, and now I'm sitting next to a hospital." There it was, the first line, loud enough that the man across the aisle glanced up from his book. Specific enough that I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because I understood immediately that this was not a woman who was simply having a hard day. This was a woman who had learned, somewhere along the way, that this kind of behavior worked for her. That somewhere, at some point, a manager had comped her a meal, an airline had upgraded her seat, a maitre d' had found her a table, all because making a scene had once, somewhere, gotten her exactly what she wanted. "I need you to understand something before I go further." I did not raise my voice. I did not call her names. I did what I have been trained to do in every high-stakes room I have ever sat in. I stayed calm. "I understand it might be an adjustment," I said, "but she needs it to breathe safely, and I'm not able to change that. If it would help, I can ask the flight attendant if there's another seat available for you." She looked at me then for the first time, really looked at me the way you look at someone you've already decided is beneath your notice. And for just one flicker of a moment, something almost human crossed her face. A brief softening around her eyes, like maybe some part of her recognized she'd gone too far already. Like maybe she had a daughter of her own once, or a mother who taught her better than this. I saw her glance, just for a fraction of a second, at the small silver locket around her own neck, and something in her expression flickered like a candle catching a draft. The moment passed as fast as it arrived. "I don't need you to fix anything," she snapped. "I need you to control your situation." Her situation, my daughter breathing, was a situation to be controlled. I turned back to Emma, who thankfully hadn't caught the tone, who was watching a luggage cart circle below us with total absorption, humming her little wordless tune. I put my hand on her small shoulder and I felt, for just a second, the old fear rise up in me, the fear every parent of a medically fragile child carries at all times like a stone in the pocket. Not fear of Emma's condition, fear of the world's reaction to it, fear of exactly this moment, the one I had quietly dreaded since the day of her diagnosis, the moment a stranger would look at my daughter and see an inconvenience instead of a child. "I want you to notice something. In my career, I have negotiated with people who held real power over real outcomes, people whose decisions moved economies and armies. I had faced far worse than an entitled woman in a blue blazer. But there is something about watching someone target your child that reaches past every ounce of professional composure you've ever built and grabs you directly by the throat. I did not let it show. Not yet. A flight attendant, a young woman named Priya with a name tag that had a small enamel pin of a sunflower on it, came down the aisle doing her routine check. The woman in the blue blazer stopped her immediately. "I need to be reseated," she announced. "I cannot sit next to medical equipment for 4 hours. Priya, to her enormous credit, kept her professional smile in place, though I could see the effort it took. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am, but we're at full capacity today. There isn't another seat available." "Then find one," the woman said. "I don't care whose seat it is. Move someone from first class if you have to." "I understand your frustration," Priya said, "but the device your seatmate's daughter is using is fully authorized by the FAA for in-flight use, and I'm not able to relocate other passengers to accommodate a personal preference." The woman's jaw tightened. "This is exactly the kind of thing that's wrong with this country," she said, loud enough that 3 rows heard her clearly. "Nobody has to accommodate anybody anymore, but I'm supposed to just sit here and suffer because some kid can't breathe right." Priya moved on, clearly rattled but professional, promising to check back. I caught her eye for half a second as she left, and something passed between us, a silent acknowledgement that this was not over. The passenger directly behind us, an older man who introduced himself later as Walt, from somewhere outside Milwaukee, leaned forward just slightly and said, in a flat, unhurried Midwestern voice, "You don't have to listen to that, ma'am. Some people just like to hear themselves talk." He said it quietly, almost to himself, but it landed exactly where it needed to. I gave him a small, grateful nod. In my line of work, I had learned that the calmest person in the room is usually the most dangerous one, not because they intend harm, but because they are the only one still thinking clearly. I felt myself settling into that old, familiar stillness. The stillness before every difficult negotiation I had ever walked into. I did not know yet how badly I would need it. For the next hour, she simmered. She made comments under her breath about special treatment and entitled parents that were clearly meant to be heard. She sighed dramatically every time the ventilator cycled. She scrolled through her phone and occasionally shot glances at Emma like my daughter's existence was a personal offense against her. At one point she asked the flight attendant, loudly, whether there was any way at all to move Emma's device to the overhead bin during the flight, as though my daughter's ability to breathe were luggage that could simply be stowed away for everyone's convenience. Priya explained, patiently, for what must have been the third time, that this was not possible, that the device needed to remain accessible for the child's safety. Emma, bless her heart, remained mostly oblivious, absorbed in a coloring book of horse breeds I'd packed specifically for this flight. She colored a Clydesdale a bright shade of purple, which is not accurate to any real Clydesdale but was, in Emma's words, more interesting that way. I laughed, my first real laugh of the trip, watching her total confidence in her own artistic choices. She held the page up to me. "Look, Mommy. His name is Duke and he's very fancy." "He's extremely fancy." I agreed, and for a moment, just a moment, I let myself forget the woman beside us entirely. The bystanders around us had started to notice too. A woman in the row behind us, maybe 70 years old with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, leaned forward and said quietly, "Honey, you're doing just fine. Don't you let her get to you." Her accent was thick and warm, unmistakably from somewhere in South Carolina or Georgia, the kind of voice that sounds like it's already forgiven you for whatever you're worried about. She introduced herself as Miss Loretta, on her way to visit her grandchildren in Tucson, and she told me, in the same warm, unhurried voice, that she had raised 5 children and buried 1 husband and had absolutely no patience left in this life for foolishness. A man across the aisle in a Yankees cap muttered, without even looking up from his phone, "Some people, I swear to God." Pure New York, blunt and to the point, no wasted words. He caught my eye a moment later and added, "You need anything, you just say the word. I got 2 kids myself. I know how this goes." I gave both of them a small grateful nod. It mattered more than they knew. Around this time, a young woman across the aisle, maybe mid-20s, wearing scrubs that suggested she was heading somewhere for work, leaned toward Emma gently and asked her about her coloring book. "That's a beautiful horse," she said. "What's his name?" "Duke," Emma said proudly. "He's very fancy and he doesn't like carrots, only apples." "That's very specific," the young woman said, smiling. "I like a horse with strong opinions." It was a small kindness, but it mattered, the way small kindnesses always do in the middle of something ugly. It reminded me that most people, given the chance, choose warmth over cruelty. It reminded me why I had chosen the work I'd chosen in the first place, because most rooms, given enough time and patience, could be brought back toward decency. Most rooms. Not all. The young woman in scrubs, I learned during a brief conversation while Emma napped for a stretch, was named Alicia, and she was traveling to Phoenix for a 2-week nursing rotation at a children's hospital, work she had chosen, she told me, specifically because of a younger brother who had spent much of his own childhood in and out of hospital rooms. "People think kids like that are fragile," she said, glancing at Emma's sleeping face. "But they're usually the toughest people in any room they're in. Nobody gives them credit for it." I remember thinking at the time that I liked her enormously, and I remember wishing, with a kind of quiet ache, that more of the world operated with her instincts instead of the instincts of the woman beside me. About 40 minutes before the mask incident, there was another moment I haven't mentioned yet. A small one, easy to miss if you weren't watching closely, but one that told me everything I needed to know about the woman I was sitting beside. The beverage cart came through, and Priya asked, pleasantly, whether anyone wanted a drink. The woman ordered a gin and tonic, specific about the brand of gin, specific about the amount of ice, specific in a way that made even this simple request feel like a small performance of authority. When Priya handed her the drink, the woman took a sip, made a face, and said, loudly enough for at least 6 rows to hear, "This is watered down. I know when a drink is watered down. Do it again, and do it right this time." Priya, remarkably patient, apologized and offered to remake it. The woman waved her off after tasting the second version too, muttering something about budget airlines cutting corners everywhere. Despite the fact that this was not, in fact, a budget airline, and despite the fact that nothing about the interaction had anything at all to do with Emma or her ventilator. I want to include this moment because I think it matters. This was not a woman who snapped only when confronted with something as sympathetic as a sick child. This was a woman who had built an entire personality around the belief that everyone around her existed to serve her comfort, in every context, at every moment, regardless of what was actually reasonable to expect. The child on the ventilator was simply the next target in a day that had already contained several smaller ones. Then, about 2.5 hours into the flight somewhere over New Mexico, everything changed. Emma's ventilator alarm gave a soft double beep, the kind that simply means it's time to switch to the mask attachment for a scheduled respiratory support cycle, something we do every single flight, every single day sometimes, a completely routine part of her care. I reached down for her bag to retrieve the mask. "Oh my God," the woman said, loud enough that half the cabin turned. "Is this going to happen every 20 minutes? I cannot do this for 4 hours. It's a scheduled treatment," I said quietly, trying to keep Emma from absorbing the tension building around her. "It only takes a few minutes." I reached over Emma to help guide the mask into place, and that is when it happened. She reached over. Her hand closed around the mask strap, and then she pulled, hard. The strap snapped free from Emma's face, and my daughter's oxygen line came with it. The mask dangling uselessly from the woman's fist as she held it up like she'd just confiscated a toy from a misbehaving child. "I am done," she announced to the cabin, her voice shaking with something that looked almost like triumph. "I paid for this seat. I did not pay to sit next to a science experiment." Emma's eyes went wide. Her small chest hitched once, twice, that specific panicked flutter I have seen exactly 4 times in 9 years and have never once forgotten. Without her mask, without her breathing support mid-cycle, her body was suddenly working overtime for something it had just been depending on a stranger's basic decency to allow. Her small fingers gripped the armrest, and I saw her lips pressed together the way they do when she's trying, with everything she has, not to cry in front of strangers. I did not scream. I want you to understand that. Every instinct in my body wanted to. Instead, something in me went completely, deliberately still, the way a surface goes still right before a storm arrives. "Give her the mask back," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, quieter than the moment seemed to call for, but underneath it was something that made the woman actually pause for a half-second before her anger swallowed it whole. "No," she said. "I've had enough. Someone move this child somewhere I don't have to look at her." The cabin had gone electric. I heard a gasp from the row behind us. Miss Loretta was already half out of her seat, hand pressed to her chest. The man in the Yankees cap had his phone raised, recording, his jaw set hard. The young woman in scrubs had stood halfway, instinct pulling her toward Emma before she caught herself. A young mother across the aisle had covered her own mouth with her hand, her toddler asleep against her shoulder, oblivious. "Ma'am," Priya's voice cut through, and I could hear real alarm in it now, not the practiced calm of before. "You need to return that immediately. That is a medical device." "I don't care what it is," the woman snapped back. "I'm not obligated to sit here and suffer because someone brought a sick kid on a plane." Walt, the man behind us, said quietly, almost to himself but just loud enough to carry, "That's somebody's baby girl. Come on now." Soft, unhurried, but every word landing like a stone dropped in still water. Beside him, his wife added, barely audible, "Lord have mercy." A different passenger, a man near the emergency exit row, unbuckled his seatbelt entirely and stood, his voice low and even. "I don't know you, ma'am, and I don't want to know you, but you need to hand that back right now before this gets a lot worse for you." He was maybe 60, broad-shouldered, the kind of calm that comes from having defused worse situations than this one in some earlier chapter of his life. The woman glanced at him and, for the first time, looked genuinely rattled. Before that moment, though, there had been a smaller escalation I haven't told you about yet, one that happened about 10 minutes before the mask came off, one that I think about often because it was the moment I should have known with absolute certainty exactly how far this woman was willing to go. Emma had reached for her water cup, the plastic one with a bendy straw that she prefers because her grip strength makes rigid straws difficult some days, and in reaching for it, her elbow had brushed lightly, barely perceptibly, against the woman's forearm on the shared armrest. It was nothing. It was the kind of contact that happens 100 times on any flight, between any two strangers forced to share 18 inches of shoulder room for several hours. The woman recoiled as though she'd been burned. "Do you mind?" she snapped, yanking her arm back and rubbing at the spot Emma's elbow had touched as though it might be contagious. "Some of us would like our own space." Emma froze, her small hand still outstretched toward her water cup, and looked up at me with an expression I recognized instantly and that broke my heart every time I saw it. The look of a child trying to figure out what she'd done wrong, when she'd done nothing wrong at all. "She barely touched you?" I said, keeping my voice level though something inside me had gone very tight and very cold. "She's reaching for her water." "Well, maybe she should ask for help instead of flailing around," the woman said. "Some of us don't want to be touched by someone who can't control her own limbs." I felt Emma's hand find mine under the tray table, gripping tight, and I squeezed back, hard, a silent promise I intended to keep. I said nothing further to the woman in that moment. I simply helped Emma with her water cup myself, guiding the straw to her lips, and I made a decision, quiet and absolute, that I would give this woman exactly one more chance to correct course before I stopped extending her any grace whatsoever. She did not take that chance. 10 minutes later, her hand closed around the mask strap instead. Somewhere behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of a phone camera's shutter click, then another, then a third, an almost rhythmic percussion of quiet outrage being documented in real time. A woman I hadn't noticed before, seated across the aisle one row up, had risen halfway out of her seat, one hand pressed over her mouth, tears already forming, the pure instinctive horror of a stranger watching a child's oxygen get threatened for no reason at all. A teenager near the back, earbuds still in, had pulled one out entirely, twisting around in his seat to see what all the commotion was, his expression shifting from confusion to disgust in the span of about 2 seconds, once he understood what had happened. I reached over and took the mask gently from her hand. She did not resist, too caught up in her own performance to notice she'd let it go, and I fitted it back over Emma's small face, watching her breathing settle, watching the panic drain slowly from her eyes as the familiar rhythm returned. I stroked her hair once, twice, and I whispered, "You're okay, baby. I've got you. You're safe." Emma's small hand found mine and held on, her fingers cold and trembling. What none of them knew yet, what this woman in the blue blazer had no possible way of understanding, was that the version of me sitting quietly beside my daughter right now was not the version she thought she was dealing with. She thought she saw a tired mother she could bully into silence. She had no idea she had just crossed a line that would end with consequences reaching far higher than she could imagine. I looked up at her. I did not raise my voice. "You're going to want to sit very still," I said, "and not say another word to my daughter or about my daughter for the rest of this flight." She laughed, an actual laugh, short and disbelieving. "Or what? You're going to have me arrested?" I didn't answer. I turned back to Emma, checked her oxygen levels on the small monitor clipped to her finger, confirmed she was stable, and I held her hand while her breathing evened out completely. She looked up at me with those same wide eyes, quieter now, and whispered, "Is she going to be mean again?" "No, baby," I said. "She's not. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because everything that happened after started right there, in that stillness. In the moment I stopped responding like a frightened mother and started responding like exactly what I actually am. What was going through my mind in that exact second was not anger, not really, though anger was certainly present, coiled somewhere underneath everything else. What I felt more than anything was clarity. The same clarity I feel walking into a room full of people who assume they hold every advantage. I have felt that clarity in rooms with far higher stakes than this one, rooms where the wrong move could unravel years of careful diplomatic work. And every single time, the advantage has belonged to the person who stays quiet the longest. For the next several minutes, I said nothing else to her. I simply took out my phone and typed a short message, then closed it again. I did not explain myself. I did not threaten. I sat with a stillness that unsettled everyone around me far more than shouting ever could have. Priya had gone to speak with the lead flight attendant near the front of the cabin. A woman named Carol whose posture, I noticed, had gone from relaxed to razor-straight the moment Priya finished speaking to her. I watched, out of the corner of my eye, as Carol's expression shifted from professional concern to something sharper, gesturing back toward our row. Carol looked directly at me then, and something passed over her face I can only describe as recognition, though we had never met. She said something quietly into a small radio clipped to her uniform, and I saw her glance toward the cockpit door. The woman in the blue blazer noticed none of this. She had crossed her arms and turned to face forward, satisfied, apparently, that she had won whatever battle she believed she was fighting. "Finally," she muttered, "some peace and quiet." She had no idea the quiet she was feeling wasn't peace. It was the eye of the storm. What she didn't know, what none of them yet fully understood, was that the message I had just sent, brief as it was, had already begun setting something in motion far beyond that cabin. Somewhere on the ground, phones were already ringing. I should explain, because I think it matters, exactly what happens when a cabinet-level official sends a message like the one I sent. It is not dramatic. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, nothing that would have given away, in that moment, the size of what was quietly unfolding 35,000 feet below us. A single secure line was activated. A duty officer somewhere confirmed my location and status. Within 4 minutes, my security detail on the ground in Phoenix, the same detail that travels with me at a discreet distance even on personal trips, had been notified of an incident aboard my flight and had already begun coordinating with the airline and with federal authorities to meet the aircraft upon arrival. None of this required me to raise my voice, or stand up, or do anything at all beyond typing a dozen words into a secure application on my phone. That, more than almost anything else, is what 6 years in this work teaches you. Real power rarely needs to announce itself loudly. It simply needs to move. I sat with Emma during those minutes, monitoring her breathing, saying nothing further to the woman beside me, watching the cabin around us shift in ways I could feel more than see. Carol passed by twice more, each time with a slightly different posture, a slightly straighter spine, the unmistakable body language of someone who has just been told something that changes how careful they need to be. Priya, walking the aisle to check seatbelts before what I now realize was a coordinated cabin-wide safety sweep meant to buy time until further instructions arrived from the cockpit, paused beside our row and gave me the smallest, most deliberate nod, the kind of nod that says, without a single word, "I know and we've got this." The woman beside me noticed none of it. She had already convinced herself the worst was behind her. That a stern word from a stranger and an uncomfortable silence was the full extent of what she'd have to weather. She actually reached for the in-flight magazine at one point, flipping through it with the studied casualness of someone trying to project total, unbothered confidence to anyone still watching her. "You'd think," she said, apparently unable to let the silence sit any longer, "that people would learn to keep their medical issues to themselves on a flight. It's really not that complicated." I did not respond. I had learned years ago in rooms far more consequential than this one that silence is often the loudest possible answer a person can give. She seemed almost energized by my quiet, mistaking it for retreat rather than what it actually was. She turned slightly in her seat, addressing not just me now but seemingly the row behind us as well, raising her voice to what I can only describe as a lecturing pitch. "I don't understand why everyone's looking at me like I did something wrong," she announced. "I have never in my life had to sit through something like this, and frankly, I think I handled it with a lot more patience than most people would have. If anything, someone should be thanking me for not making a bigger scene." Miss Loretta made a small, disbelieving sound behind us, something between a scoff and a prayer. Walt muttered something to his wife that I couldn't quite catch, though his tone needed no translation. The woman, apparently emboldened rather than chastened by the silence around her, continued. "You people act like I'm the villain here," she said, and I remember being struck, even in that moment, by the strange precision of the word she'd chosen, villain, as though some part of her already sensed the shape of the story this day was becoming, even as she insisted on its opposite. I'm the one who had to sit next to a walking hospital for 4 hours. Nobody asked how that affected my trip. Nobody once considered my comfort in any of this. It was, I would learn much later, almost the last truly triumphant sentence she would ever get to say out loud in public before consequences began arriving in earnest. She said it with her chin lifted, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who believes, right up until the last possible second, that she has won. About 10 minutes later, the intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice came through, calm but with an unmistakable edge of seriousness beneath the professional tone pilots are trained to use. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been made aware of an incident in the cabin involving the interference with a passenger's medical device. I want to assure everyone that the situation is being handled, and I ask for everyone's patience as we work through this together. We will also be requesting law enforcement meet the aircraft upon arrival in Phoenix as a standard precaution." The cabin went dead silent. The woman beside me shifted in her seat, some of her earlier confidence flickering for the first time. "Handled how?" she asked, to nobody, to everybody. "It's not that big a deal. It's a piece of plastic." I turned to her then, and I let just a fraction of what I actually am show through, just enough. "You interfered with a federally regulated medical device on a commercial aircraft," I said quietly. "You put a child in physical danger for your own comfort. And you did it in front of 30 witnesses and at least 4 working cameras." She stared at me. For the first time since she'd sat down, real uncertainty crossed her face. "Who exactly do you think you're talking to?" she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," I said. "The question you should be asking is whether you know who you're talking to." She let out a small, incredulous huff, the last gasp of her old confidence trying to reassert itself. "Is that supposed to scare me?" "No," I said. "It's supposed to be honest. Something you haven't been very good at today." I reached into my bag, the same navy blue tote I'd carried through airport security 100 times without a second glance from anyone, and I pulled out my federal credentials, the ones I generally never need to show anyone outside of secured government buildings. I placed them face up on the tray table between us. I placed it on the tray table. She looked down at it. And for the first time since she had boarded this flight, she went completely silent. Her eyes moved across the seal, across my photograph, across the title beneath it, reading it once, then again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying on a second pass. I watched her lips move slightly, silently, mouthing the title to herself as if saying it internally might help her believe it. I watched her face move through exactly the stages I have seen 100 times in adversaries far more sophisticated than her. Confusion first, the simple failure to process what her eyes were telling her. Then disbelief, the assumption that this had to be some kind of mistake, some prop, some elaborate misunderstanding. Then, slowly, recognition as she connected the title to the news coverage she must have half remembered from some segment she'd scrolled past a dozen times without really absorbing. And finally, panic, real and total, as she understood exactly what she had done and exactly who she had done it to. "You're," she started and stopped. "United States Secretary of State," I said quietly. "Currently traveling privately with my daughter to a medical appointment. Which means every word you have said in the last 3 hours and every action you have taken has just occurred in the presence of a sitting cabinet official, roughly 24 witnesses, and, judging by the number of phones I've noticed raised in the last 10 minutes, considerably more than 24 recordings." The color drained from her face entirely. Her hand, still resting on the armrest between us, was visibly shaking now. "I didn't know," she said, and her voice had gone thin and small in a way that made half the cabin lean in to hear it. "I didn't know who you were." That, I said. Was never the point. You didn't know my daughter needed that mask to keep breathing safely either. It didn't stop you from taking it. She opened her mouth as if to argue, some old reflex still trying to claw its way back to the surface, some last instinct towards self-preservation through bluster. I have rights too, she managed. You can't just. You have exactly the rights every other passenger on this aircraft has, I said, cutting her off, still not raising my voice. None of them include putting your hands on someone else's medical equipment. Before she could respond further, the curtain up front parted, and 2 federal air marshals I had not even known were on this flight. Because of course there were, because of course my security detail does not simply vanish because I'm traveling to a doctor's appointment. Moved down the aisle with quiet, unhurried authority. Carol, the lead flight attendant, followed close behind them, her professional composure fully restored now that she understood exactly what she was dealing with. The cabin, which had been tense and murmuring, went almost reverently silent, the way a courtroom goes silent right before a verdict. Ma'am, one of the marshals said, standing over her seat, we're going to need you to come with us. This is ridiculous, she said, though her voice cracked on the word, all her earlier bravado gone. I barely touched anything. It's a piece of plastic. You interfered with a medical device required for a minor's respiratory function during flight, the marshal said evenly. That's a federal offense under aviation safety regulations, separate and apart from any state charges related to endangerment. You're also going to want to sit with the fact that you did this in front of the Secretary of State. I want a lawyer, she said quickly, the way people say it when they've watched enough television to know the phrase but not enough to understand it doesn't work the way they think it does at 35,000 feet. You'll get one, the marshal said. Once we land, and federal agents meet this aircraft, which they will, because that call was already made 10 minutes ago. She turned to me then, and for one final moment, her old entitlement flickered back to life. You're really going to ruin my whole life over a stupid mask? I looked at her, and I felt something settle inside me, cold and clear and completely certain. I'm not going to ruin anything, I said. You did that yourself, the moment you decided my daughter's ability to breathe was less important than your comfort. I'm simply the person whose job it is to make sure there are consequences for that decision. She tried one more angle, quieter now, almost pleading. I have a family. I have a husband on the HOA board with me. This will be in the papers. It will, I agreed. That part is entirely up to the choices you already made. She tried once more, her voice dropping even further. Some last desperate attempt at finding an ally in the small crowded space around her. She turned to the row behind us, to Miss Loretta and Walt, and said, almost pleading, You all saw how she was talking to me. You saw I was provoked. Nobody's mentioning that part. Miss Loretta looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that carries decades of patience finally run dry. Ma'am, she said, I have never in my whole life seen anybody provoked into pulling a breathing mask off a child. I raised 5 babies and buried a husband, and I have never once seen anything like what you did on this airplane today. You don't get my sympathy just because you're scared now that somebody's finally holding you accountable. Walt added nothing further, only shook his head slowly, the particular silence of a man who has already said everything he intends to say on the matter. The man near the emergency row, the one who had stood earlier, simply looked at her and said, Ma'am, I think you should stop talking now. In a tone that left no room for negotiation. She had nothing left to say to that. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, and finally settled into a thin, defeated line. The cabin erupted, not into chaos, but into something closer to release. The man in the Yankees cap actually clapped, once, sharp and satisfied. Miss Loretta said, loud enough for the whole cabin, Well, thank the good Lord for that. Walt, behind us, muttered, About time, and his wife squeezed his arm. Someone near the back let out a low whistle. The young woman in scrubs across the aisle exhaled audibly, pressing a hand to her chest. It wasn't chaos. It was relief, the kind that comes when people who have watched something wrong happen finally get to watch it made right. The marshals escorted her to the front of the plane, where she would remain, seated between them, silent for the rest of the flight, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Carol handed her out of what I can only assume was professional habit rather than sympathy. I turned back to Emma. My daughter looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, are you in trouble?" I laughed. A real laugh, the only one that whole flight, bright and unguarded. The tension of the last 3 hours breaking all at once. "No, baby. Not even a little bit." "Then why does everyone keep looking at us?" "Because you're very brave," I said. "And some people just figured that out a little late." "I didn't do anything," Emma said, frowning slightly. That particular frown she gets when she's trying to work out a puzzle that doesn't quite make sense yet. "You breathed," I told her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "That's plenty." I held her hand for the rest of the flight, checking her oxygen levels every few minutes out of habit more than necessity, watching her color 3 more horses in colors no horse has ever actually been. Miss Loretta reached forward at one point and squeezed my shoulder gently. "You did real good, honey," she said. "Both of you did." Walt leaned forward too, offering Emma a small pretzel packet from his own snack, which she accepted with the solemn dignity of someone receiving an award. Carol came by personally about 20 minutes later, crouching in the aisle beside our row, so she was at Emma's eye level. "I just wanted to come tell you," she said to Emma, "that you were the calmest person on this whole airplane today. I've been doing this job 17 years, and I don't think I've ever seen anybody handle a scary moment as well as you just did." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a queen accepting a formal tribute. "Gary helped," she said, patting the ventilator bag. "He's my breathing buddy." "Well, Gary did a great job too," Carol said, and I saw something in her professional composure crack just slightly, just enough to let real feeling through. Somewhere over the last hour of the flight, the man near the emergency row who had stood up earlier came by our seats on his way to the restroom and paused. "I don't know if you remember me standing up back there," he said. "I just wanted to say, for what it's worth, I've got a granddaughter with cerebral palsy. I know what it's like watching people treat her like she's an inconvenience for existing. What you did back there, staying calm the way you did, that took more strength than most people have. Whoever you are." He didn't know yet at that point, and it didn't matter to him. That mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened that day. When we landed in Phoenix, an airline representative met us at the gate, apologizing profusely, offering vouchers I didn't particularly care about and information about the formal complaint process I told them I would follow up on later, once I'd had time to simply be Emma's mother again instead of anyone's secretary of anything. 2 federal agents met the aircraft as promised, walking the woman off in handcuffs in full view of the jet bridge, past dozens of passengers from other flights who had absolutely no idea what they were witnessing, only that it looked serious and it looked final. I watched, from a distance, as she was led past a bank of windows overlooking the tarmac, her blazer wrinkled now, her sunglasses long gone, her posture nothing like the woman who had swept down that aisle 3.5 hours earlier expecting the world to rearrange itself around her comfort. The consequences, once they began, did not arrive all at once. They arrived the way consequences for people like her usually do, one at a time, each one landing before the last one had even finished stinging. The first came within hours, while she was still being processed at a federal facility near Sky Harbor. The airline suspended her frequent flyer status permanently and issued a formal notice barring her from future travel on their aircraft. A notice that, I later learned, took less than 90 minutes to draft once legal counsel reviewed the recorded footage from no fewer than 6 separate passengers. The second came the following morning, when the story broke publicly. A local Phoenix News affiliate picked up the footage first, and within 6 hours it had been reposted by a national outlet, then another, then dozens more, the specific detail of the confiscated breathing mask serving as the kind of visceral, undeniable image that makes a story impossible to look away from. By that evening, her full name, obtained through public flight manifests and swiftly cross-referenced by internet sleuths with more patience than I will ever have, had been attached to the video in every single reposting. The third consequence came 2 days later, when her employer, a mid-sized insurance firm where she had worked in a client relations role for 11 years, placed her on unpaid administrative leave pending review. She was terminated formally 8 days after that, once the review concluded that her conduct, quote, reflected values fundamentally incompatible with the company's public-facing mission. A sentence I read later in a company statement that struck me as almost comically formal given what it was actually describing. The fourth consequence, and in some ways the one that seemed to affect her most, according to reporting I read afterward, was the homeowners association she had served as secretary for 6 years. The board held an emergency session, and by unanimous vote, removed her from her position, citing conduct unbecoming of an officer. Neighbors who had once feared her fines and her complaints and her endless procedural nitpicking now openly discussed. In interviews with local reporters, years of grievances they'd been too intimidated to raise before. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who had lived beside her for 9 years, told a reporter on camera, with what I can only describe as visible relish, that he had once been fined $400 for a garden gnome the association deemed insufficiently tasteful. A fine he had paid without contest at the time out of simple exhaustion. He said watching her led off that plane in handcuffs was, in his words, better than winning the lottery. The fifth and final consequence, the one that took the longest to unfold, arrived nearly 2 months later in a federal courtroom in Phoenix, where she pleaded guilty to interference with a medical device required for a minor's safety, a federal offense, in exchange for prosecutors dropping a more serious charge related to reckless endangerment. She received 18 months of probation, a substantial fine, 100 hours of community service specifically designated to be performed at a pediatric care facility, and a permanent federal flag on her travel record that will require additional security screening on any future flight she takes for the rest of her life. The judge, according to the court transcript I later requested, told her directly from the bench that her conduct represented, quote, a level of entitlement so extreme it endangered a child's life over a matter of personal comfort, and that the sentence was designed to ensure she never forgot the weight of that choice. I did not attend that hearing. I did not need to. I had already gotten what I needed the moment I watched Emma breathe easily again in her hotel bed that night. Her small chest rising and falling in that steady rhythm I have counted more times than I could ever number. I did, however, hear about the community service portion of her sentence some months later, through a reporter who had followed the story from the beginning and reached out to my office for a final comment before publishing a retrospective piece. The pediatric care facility where she'd been assigned to complete her hours, it turned out, specialized in exactly the kind of respiratory and neuromuscular conditions Emma lives with. For 100 hours, spread across several months, this woman who had once yanked a breathing mask off a 9-year-old's face for her own comfort was required to spend her afternoons in the presence of children just like Emma, assisting with basic non-medical tasks, folding laundry, restocking supply carts, sitting with families in waiting rooms while doctors delivered news that ranged from routine to devastating. The reporter told me, off the record, that staff at the facility described her early weeks there as sullen and resentful, the same entitled posture she'd carried onto that airplane seemingly intact despite everything that had happened to her since. But something shifted, apparently, somewhere around week 6, after she spent an entire afternoon sitting with a mother whose son had just been placed on a ventilator for the first time. A mother who was frightened and exhausted and grateful for anyone willing to simply sit beside her in the waiting room and not ask her to perform composure she didn't have. The staff member who supervised her said she came out of that room quieter than usual, and that her attitude, however slowly, however grudgingly, began to change after that. I don't know if that change was real or performed, and I try not to spend much energy wondering. It isn't my job to rehabilitate her, and it was never my goal on that flight to destroy her either, whatever the internet ultimately decided to make of the footage. My only goal, from the second her hand closed around that mask strap, was to make sure Emma was safe and that there would be consequences serious enough to mean something. Whatever this woman does with the rest of her life, whatever she learns or refuses to learn from 100 hours spent among children like my daughter, is entirely up to her now. That part of the story doesn't belong to me anymore. I did not go watch her be processed. I did not ask for updates in the moment. I turned instead to gathering Emma's things, checking her ventilator's charge, making sure her wheelchair was where it should be, doing the 100 small logistical tasks that are simply part of being her mother, tasks that don't stop or pause just because something enormous has happened around them. As we made our way slowly up the jet bridge, several of our fellow passengers lingered near the gate rather than rushing off toward their connections. An unusual thing on any flight, where people typically scatter toward baggage claim within seconds of the seatbelt sign switching off. Miss Loretta caught up to us first, moving carefully with her cane, and pressed a small folded piece of paper into my hand. "That's my number, honey," she said. "You call me if you ever need anything, or if that sweet girl just wants someone to talk horses with. I raised 5 children. I've got plenty of patience left for one more if she ever needs it. I still have that number saved in my phone. We have not called her, not yet, though I think about it more often than I probably should admit." Walt and his wife caught up next, Walt crouching slightly to speak directly to Emma. "You did real good today," he told her. "Better than most grown-ups would have done." Emma, delighted by the attention and entirely unaware of the gravity behind it, informed him solemnly that she thought Gary, her ventilator, deserved credit too, and Walt agreed with the sincerity of a man who understood exactly how much that machine meant to the child in front of him. The man from the emergency row, whose name I later learned was Gregory, a retired firefighter from Sacramento, shook my hand at the gate and said simply, "You handled that better than I would have. I just wanted you to know somebody besides your daughter noticed." Alicia, hurrying toward her connecting flight, paused just long enough to squeeze Emma's shoulder gently and tell her to keep coloring fancy horses, whatever anybody else says about it. It was a small collection of strangers, gathered for a few minutes near a gate in Phoenix, none of them owing me or Emma anything at all beyond common decency, and yet each of them had chosen, in that ordinary airport moment, to make sure we knew we hadn't been alone in that cabin. I think about that gathering often, more than I sometimes think about the woman herself. It would be easy, telling a story like this, to let the villain take up all the space in the retelling. I don't want to do that. I want to remember Miss Loretta's number folded into my palm, and Walt's granddaughterly patience with a 9-year-old talking about a ventilator like it was a beloved pet, and Gregory's quiet firefighter steadiness, and Alicia's easy warmth toward a child other people had spent the last 3 hours treating like a burden. That is the actual story, as far as I'm concerned. The woman in the blue blazer was simply the reason the rest of them had the chance to show who they really were. Later that night, in our hotel room, after Emma had fallen asleep with her breathing machine humming its quiet familiar rhythm beside her, I sat by the window and let myself finally feel everything I hadn't allowed myself to feel on that plane. My hands shook, just slightly. The delayed adrenaline of a mother who had watched her child's air get taken away by a stranger's careless hand. I cried quietly, not from fear anymore, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of having my daughter safe and breathing steadily in the bed beside me. I sat there for a long time, watching her small chest rise and fall, that rhythm I have watched and counted and prayed over for 9 years now, and I thought about how close I had come, more than once in my life, to losing the thing that mattered most to me while I was busy protecting things that mattered far less. My sister called that night. She'd already seen a clip of the incident online, shaky cell phone footage someone had posted with the caption "Secretary of State calmly destroys entitled Karen who attacked disabled child on flight," already racking up views by the hundreds of thousands. She was laughing and crying at the same time on the phone, the way sisters do. "You didn't even yell," she said. "I would have flipped that woman's tray table over." I told her I'd wanted to. I told her that some version of me, somewhere underneath everything I've trained myself to be, wanted exactly that. But that version doesn't get to run the show. Not when Emma is watching. Not ever, really. We talked for almost an hour that night, longer than we'd talked on the phone in months, both of us circling back again and again to the same disbelieving refrain. Can you believe that actually happened? My sister, who has known Emma since the day she was born, who drove 3 hours every weekend for the first 2 years of Emma's life just to help me manage the exhausting logistics of early diagnosis, asked me at one point whether I was really okay, underneath the composed version of events I'd been giving her. I told her the truth. I told her that for about 4 seconds, right after that mask came off, I had felt something in myself I don't often let surface, something closer to rage than anything I allow myself to feel in professional settings. I told her that the only thing standing between that rage and something much louder was Emma's small hand finding mine under the tray table, grounding me, reminding me without a single word that the version of her mother she needed in that moment was not the version who screams. She needed the version who stays steady. I have spent years building that version of myself in rooms far more dangerous than an airplane cabin, and on that Tuesday afternoon, for the first time, I finally understood exactly why I had bothered. My sister was quiet for a moment after I said that, and then she said something I've thought about often since. "You built that whole career. she said. And I always wondered what it was really for. I think I finally get it. It wasn't ever really about the job. It was about being ready for the one moment somebody tried to hurt her and you needed to know exactly what to do. I didn't have an answer for that. I just held the phone a little tighter and listened to Emma's ventilator humming steadily in the next room. And I let myself feel, for the first time all day, something close to peace. I did not sleep well that night, despite the relief. I kept replaying the moment the mask came off, over and over, the specific angle of the woman's wrist as she pulled, the specific flutter of Emma's chest as her breathing caught. I have negotiated ceasefires. I have sat in rooms where the wrong word could have ended lives on a scale I still find hard to fully process. And none of it, not one moment of any of it, prepared me for how it would feel to watch someone threaten my own daughter's breath for something as small and as ugly as her own comfort. I learned 2 weeks later that the woman had been charged federally for interference with a medical device on an aircraft, a charge that carries real weight under aviation law, and separately faced state charges for child endangerment. Her name, which had once opened doors for her in every restaurant and boutique in her wealthy suburb outside Dallas, was now attached permanently to news articles that will follow her for the rest of her life. She lost her position on the board of her homeowners association within the week, once her neighbors saw the footage that had already been viewed millions of times online, footage that showed, in painful clarity, exactly what kind of person she had chosen to be when she thought no consequences were watching. I understand she has not been seen at her country club since. I understand her husband quietly filed for divorce 11 days after the story broke, though I have no way of confirming that beyond what reached me secondhand. And honestly, it isn't my business to confirm it. That part of her life belongs to her now, the way the plane belonged to all of us for those 3.5 hours. I don't think about her much anymore. I think about Emma instead, about the way she picked her Clydesdale purple because she decided it should be, about the way she held my hand through the worst 3 hours of that flight without ever losing her strange steady faith that her mother would fix it. I think about Miss Loretta's warm South Carolina voice telling me I'd done good. I think about Walt's quiet Wisconsin steadiness, offering a pretzel packet to a 9-year-old like it was the most natural gesture in the world. I think about the man with the granddaughter, telling me strength doesn't always look like shouting. A few weeks after we returned home, I received a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, forwarded through my office, from a mother in Ohio whose son has cerebral palsy, telling me that after she saw the footage of what happened on that flight, she finally worked up the courage to fly with her son for the first time in 3 years, something she'd been too afraid to attempt after a bad experience on a previous trip. She wrote that watching a mother stay calm and get justice for her daughter gave her something she hadn't had in a long time, proof that the world could still make room for kids like hers. I keep that letter in the drawer of my desk at home, not my office, my home desk, where Emma does her homework most afternoons, because I want it close to the life it's actually about. That letter was not the only one. Over the following months, my office received hundreds of messages from parents of medically fragile children across the country, some sharing their own stories of being made to feel small or burdensome on flights, in restaurants, in classrooms, in doctors' offices that should have known better. I could not respond to all of them personally, though I tried, some evenings after Emma had gone to bed, to answer at least a handful by hand. One father in rural Montana wrote to tell me his daughter, who has a condition similar to Emma's, had started asking to watch the video before bed some nights. Not because she found it exciting, but because, in his words, she likes seeing a mom fight for a kid like her and win. I read that line to Emma once, without telling her it was about her own story, and she simply nodded seriously and said, "That's a good mom," entirely unaware she was describing herself and me both in the same breath. The airline, for its part, used the incident as the basis for a new training initiative for flight crews on de-escalation involving passengers with visible or invisible disabilities, something I learned about only because Priya, the young flight attendant with the sunflower pin, reached out to me nearly 4 months later to let me know she had been asked to help develop part of the curriculum, drawing directly on what she'd witnessed that day. I found something quietly satisfying in that, the idea that a single ugly afternoon over New Mexico might spare some other child, some other mother, the particular terror Emma and I had lived through. I think, too, about the version of that day that could have happened, the version where I was not who I am, where there was no federal credential to place on a tray table, where the only weapon I had was the same exhausted outrage every other parent in that situation would have felt. I think about all the mothers and fathers who face exactly what I faced, minus the particular authority I happened to carry in my bag that day, and who have no dramatic reveal waiting to rescue them, no marshals coming down the aisle, no cameras catching a satisfying resolution. Their stories matter just as much as mine. Their children deserve just as much protection. If anything came out of that flight beyond Emma's safety and my own peace of mind, I hope it is this: a reminder that the woman beside you on a plane, however ordinary she looks, however tired, however unassuming, might be carrying far more strength than you have any right to assume. And even when she isn't carrying a badge, she is still carrying a mother's love, which has its own kind of authority, its own kind of consequence, whether the world chooses to recognize it or not. What that woman never understood, and what I hope everyone watching this understands, is that the people you decide are safe to mistreat are never actually who you think they are. Sometimes the quiet mother beside you on a plane has spent her career learning exactly how to make sure people like you face consequences. And sometimes the sickest, smallest, most vulnerable person in the room turns out to be the strongest one on board. Emma still hums her little tuneless song. She still lines up her 43 horses in the exact order only she understands, an order that has since expanded, at last count, to include a 44th horse we bought together in Phoenix, a small purple Clydesdale figurine she named, without a moment's hesitation, Justice. She didn't know, when she named him, why the word felt right to her. She just liked the sound of it. I've never corrected her assumption that it was simply a pretty name. And every single night, when I check her breathing machine before bed, I remember that on one Tuesday afternoon over New Mexico, a stranger tried to take her air away and found out exactly whose daughter she really was. If there is one thing I would want anyone watching this to carry with them, it's this: the calmest person in the room is not always the weakest one. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the exact right moment to remind everyone, all at once, exactly what they've been capable of the entire time. Emma is 11 now, as I sit here putting this into words. 2 years have passed since that flight, and she has grown in every way a mother could hope for: taller, more stubborn, more herself with every passing season. She still loves horses, though her tastes have expanded to include a fairly serious opinion on equestrian competition formats she picked up from a documentary she now insists on rewatching at least once a month. Her 44 horse figurines have become 51, each new edition earning its own careful place in an order that continues to make sense only to her. She still hums when she's happy, and she is happy most days, in the specific unbothered way of a child who has never once been made to feel like her body was something to apologize for. She does not remember the flight in great detail anymore, or at least she claims not to, though I sometimes wonder how much of that is true forgetting and how much is simply a child's mind protecting itself from a memory too frightening to hold onto closely. What she does remember, and what she brings up sometimes unprompted, usually while we're doing something completely unrelated, folding laundry or driving to physical therapy, is the feeling of my hand around hers under that tray table. "You held on the whole time," she said to me once, almost a year after it happened, apropos of nothing, while we sat at the kitchen table doing her homework. "Even when the mean lady was being mean, you didn't let go." I told her I never would. I meant it as much as I have ever meant anything. I think often about the randomness of what happened that day, about how differently things might have gone if I had been anyone else, if the woman in the blue blazer had happened to sit beside a different mother on a different flight, one without a federal credential in her bag, one without a security detail waiting quietly on the ground in Phoenix. I think about the version of that story where the mother has no recourse beyond a formal complaint that gets filed and forgotten, where the child's fear goes unwitnessed by any camera that will ever matter to anyone beyond the people already in that cabin. That version of the story happens far more often than mine did. It happens to families every single day, in airports and grocery stores and school pickup lines across this country. Families who do not have the specific and unusual luck I happen to be carrying with me that afternoon. That is part of why I have chosen to tell this story publicly at all, beyond the footage that already existed without my consent or control. I want people to understand that dignity should not require a security detail to be protected. I want people to understand that a child's right to breathe safely, to exist in public space without being treated as an inconvenience, should never have depended on whether her mother happened to hold a particular title. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. It should only have mattered that a 9-year-old girl needed her breathing mask, and a grown woman decided her own comfort mattered more. I have thought, too, about forgiveness, about whether I've found any for the woman who did this, and I'll be honest with you. I'm not entirely sure. I don't carry active anger toward her anymore. Not the way I did in the raw days right after it happened. But I don't know that what I feel now qualifies as forgiveness either. I think most days, I simply feel something closer to distance, the natural distance that grows between a person and an experience once enough time has passed and enough healing has occurred. I hope, genuinely, that whatever she took from those 100 hours of community service stays with her. I hope she is kinder now to whoever she encounters, in whatever context she encounters them. But that hope is separate from forgiveness, and I don't feel obligated to pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier ending. What I do feel, clearly and without any hesitation, is gratitude. Gratitude for Miss Loretta's warm, steady voice telling me I'd done good. Gratitude for Walt's quiet Wisconsin patience, and for his wife's soft, murmured prayer. Gratitude for the man near the emergency row who stood up for a stranger's child without a second thought. Gratitude for Alicia, the young nurse who saw Emma as a person worth talking to about horses instead of a medical inconvenience to be managed. Gratitude for Priya and Carol, who did their jobs with more courage and clarity than most people ever get to demonstrate in their entire careers. Gratitude, more than anything, for a daughter who held my hand through the worst 3 hours of her young life and came out the other side still humming her tuneless little songs, still lining up her horses in an order only she understands, still fundamentally, stubbornly herself. There is a photograph I keep on my desk now, taken by Priya on her personal phone with my permission, just before we deplaned in Phoenix that day. In it, Emma is sitting in her wheelchair near the jet bridge, her breathing mask resting comfortably against her cheek, a wide gap-toothed grin on her face because Carol had just told her a joke about airplane peanuts that Emma apparently found hysterical. You cannot tell, looking at that photograph, that anything at all had happened on that flight. You cannot see the fear or the fury or the federal marshals or the credentials on the tray table. You just see a happy little girl, laughing at a joke about peanuts, completely unaware of how close the world had come to teaching her, that day, that her existence was something to apologize for. She never learned that lesson. Not that day and not since. And of everything that happened on that flight, of everything I have told you here, that is the outcome I am proudest of by far. Not the consequences delivered to the woman who hurt her. Not the credentials on the tray table or the marshals in the aisle or the headlines that followed. Just this. My daughter got off that plane in Phoenix exactly as unashamed of herself as she got on it in Charlotte. And as long as I have any say in the matter, she always will.